I offered my jacket, but the alien Heiress wanted the rest of me too. Rylan Voss felt the impact first in his gut, a sudden, violent jolt that rattled every bolt in the cockpit. The starship's hull groaned, and a shrill alarm rang through his helmet's comm. He wrestled with the controls, eyes flicking over the cracked display that spat sparks. The console read atmospheric turbulence dangerously high. He let out a harsh breath, mouth dry. Another lurch, and the craft spiraled, metal shrieking against unseen forces. The horizon tilted, revealing a jagged landscape bathed in the burnt orange hues of a dying sun. He swore under his breath, fighting to level out, but the thrusters refused to respond. It was only a matter of seconds before the craft slammed into the dunes below. He braced for impact, fingers clamped around the pilot's wheel. The ship carved a violent trench in the shifting sand. He lurched forward, harness digging into his chest as the world dissolved into sparks and screeching metal. Finally, the wreck ground to a stop. Smoke filled his lungs. The console blinked once, then died in a sputter of electricity. Rylan coughed, wincing at the pain in his ribs. With the flick of a manual release, he popped the canopy, warm air searing his face. He pushed himself out of the seat, stumbling over twisted metal and sparking wires. His breath caught when he saw the horizon, an endless sea of dunes that shimmered like powdered glass. Off in the distance, dark rock formations jutted from the sands, half-buried ruins of a civilization he didn't recognize. The place was a graveyard of shifting grains and stark shadows. His craft was reduced to a battered husk, half-submerged in a dune. He tried to assess the damage with shaky hands, carefully rummaging through compartments. Most of the supplies were scattered, but he found a half-charged pistol, a small ration pack, and a battered jacket. He slung the jacket over one shoulder. His flight suit was torn at the calf, a slow trickle of blood staining the fabric. That was manageable. The greater concern was how he would get off this planet, or even survive the night. The local star was sinking quickly. Already the temperature dropped, the wind picking up in eerie whistles across the dunes. Rylan tapped his comm. Static. He tapped again, scanning frequencies. No response. Either the planet's atmospheric interference was blocking signals, or there was simply no one listening. His heart sank at the thought of being stranded, but he refused to give in to despair. He'd faced worse. He reminded himself of that. Then again, he'd never quite been so alone. He took a moment to rub at the scar on his right cheek, the memory of the last mission that went catastrophically wrong flashing through his mind. A pang of guilt twisted in his chest. He swallowed, trying to focus on the present. He had to keep moving, find shelter, figure out a plan. It was always the same routine after a crash. Gather what you can, scout the terrain, don't waste time cursing fate. He made it maybe 2 dunes over before the wind kicked up in earnest. Sand pelted his face, stinging like 1,000 needles. He raised his arms to shield himself. The air smelled of mineral dust, metallic and raw. The sun slipped lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and pinks. He trudged on, eyes narrowed. On the horizon, there was a faint flicker of movement, a shape, or perhaps just a mirage. He blinked, uncertain. The shape moved again. He froze, instincts on high alert. He crouched behind a ridge of sand, heart pounding. Then he saw the silhouette more clearly. It looked humanoid, but there was something odd about the proportions. The slender limbs, the elongated ears that caught the last rays of sunlight. It seemed to be scanning the area, cautious. He weighed his options. This could be friend or foe. Considering his predicament, any contact might be better than none. Yet the memory of that last mission, where a single wrong assumption cost him his entire squad, loomed large. His body tensed with indecision. The figure crested a dune and disappeared. Rylan's gut told him to follow, so he did, keeping low. He didn't expect the figure to circle around behind him with near-silent footsteps. He didn't realize he'd lost track of it until he felt something press lightly against his back, some kind of blade or perhaps a staff. He raised his hands slowly. "I'm not looking for a fight," he managed, voice echoing in the hush of the desert twilight. He could almost feel the presence behind him, the air shifting with a quiet tension. A moment passed, and the pressure eased. He turned carefully, noticing the figure had indeed drawn a short, curved blade. A woman, yet not human. Her skin was a pale lavender, and though the dying light was faint, he could see subtle silver threads along her temples. Her eyes were an intense violet, shot through with flickers of pink, as though they held an ember's glow deep inside. Her hair, black with a violet sheen, cascaded down her back in a sleek curtain. She regarded him with caution, her elongated ears angled slightly back. He took a breath. "Name's Rylan," he said, keeping his voice calm. She didn't respond immediately, studying him in silence. She looked poised to either vanish or strike. He gently set the pistol on the sand, showing he wasn't here to harm her. Her voice, when it came, was low and resonant. "You fell from the sky in that broken vessel." It wasn't quite a question, more of a statement. Her accent gave each word a melodic tilt. He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Crash-landed, yes. Didn't have much choice. Are you from here?" She hesitated, the blade still in her hand, though not raised. "I am from Vesharath, yes, but you are not. This territory is dangerous for outsiders." Her eyes flicked toward the horizon, where a haze of dust clouds swirled in the distance. He followed her gaze, noticing the shifting terrain seemed to shimmer in an almost predatory way, as though the ground itself was alive with destructive energy. "I can see that," he said, swallowing the dryness in his throat. "Listen, I just need to find shelter. Maybe a way to fix my ship or get off-world. I'm not looking for trouble." She studied him a moment longer, then slid the blade into a scabbard at her hip. "I can take you to a safer place for the night," she said, though there was an edge in her tone that warned him not to push his luck. "But if you intend to survive, you will need more than that battered pistol." He glanced at the pistol, half buried in the sand now, and gave a wry shrug. "Right, well, lead the way." They trekked across the dunes, the wind whipping between them. Rylan was surprised to feel the temperature plummet. He saw her shiver slightly, though she tried to hide it. Without a second thought, he slipped off his jacket. He approached carefully, holding it out. "You look cold." She paused, glancing at the jacket, then at him. "You're offering your garment to me?" There was a faint curiosity in her voice, almost a challenge. He nodded. "It's a human thing, maybe a personal thing. Just take it if you want it. If not, I'll keep it." She hesitated, then took it with a small nod. "I am called Lirae Vekathra," she said, voice quiet as she draped the jacket around her slender frame. "But Lirae is easier to say." He gave her a half-smile. "Thank you for not letting me freeze out here, Lirae." She raised a brow. "I have not saved you yet. We must reach shelter." Her tone was dry, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes that hadn't been there before. They walked in uneasy companionship until they reached a shallow gorge. Veins of crystal ran along the rocky walls, catching the moonlight in faintly shimmering seams. Rylan stared in fascination at the ridges that pulsed with an inner warmth, as though the planet itself carried a living current. He felt a low vibration beneath his boots, and Lirae paused to press her palm against the stone. A subtle hum emanated from her, a gentle series of harmonic tones that resonated with the rock. He watched in awe as the vibrations in the stone eased, like a tension was being soothed by her presence. She nodded in satisfaction, then beckoned him onward. They squeezed through a narrow passageway that opened into a small cavern. The walls rippled like polished stone, reflecting the soft luminescence of the crystals embedded in them. Rylan exhaled, grateful to be out of the biting wind. Lirae shrugged off the jacket, handing it back to him. "The rock here retains enough heat to keep us warm for the night." He nodded, draping the jacket over a protrusion in the wall. "Thank you." A moment passed, both of them standing there, uncertain. He took the chance to study her more closely. She was tall, though he still had a few inches on her. The planes of her face were sharp, regal. She had a confident set to her shoulders that hinted at a life of authority or training. The silver lines at her temples seemed to pulse in time with her breathing. She noticed his gaze. "You have questions," she said flatly. He gave a wry smile, sinking down to sit on a smooth stone ledge. "A few, yeah. But we've got all night, I suppose." She knelt opposite him, resting on her heels. "Ask." He cleared his throat. "First, thank you for not leaving me to die out there. Second, why are you out here alone?" Her expression flickered, a moment of hesitation. "I could ask you the same. But since you offered me your jacket, I will answer. I left my people's settlement to avoid a duty that was being forced upon me. I needed to see if there was another path." He didn't press for details. He understood the need to run from burdens. "Well, I didn't exactly choose to crash land, but I'm between jobs. I was ferrying cargo through this sector. My nav system glitched, or maybe I miscalculated the route. I ended up caught in your planet's atmosphere and, well, you saw the result." She studied him in silence. "You are lucky to be alive. Vasharath's atmosphere is hostile, laced with gravitational pockets that shift unpredictably." He grimaced, remembering the violent turbulence. "So I noticed. Is there a settlement nearby where I can find parts to repair my ship or call for help?" Her gaze flicked downward. "Possibly. But the settlements that remain, they are not all friendly to outsiders. And I am not eager to show my face there. My people are not united as they once were." He recognized the subtle pain in her voice, that sense of something lost. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She nodded, but said nothing more. They shared a heavy silence. Eventually, exhaustion from the crash took hold, and Rylan leaned back against the warm stone. Lirae seemed restless, occasionally humming soft notes that made the crystals in the walls tremble with gentle harmonies. He found the sound oddly comforting, almost like a lullaby. Before he knew it, he drifted into a fitful sleep. He woke hours later to find Lirae standing at the cavern entrance, her silhouette outlined by the faint light of dawn. She glanced over as he stirred. "We should move soon. The day's storms will begin, and we need to find you something more durable than that pistol if you are to survive." He rubbed his eyes, rising stiffly. His ribs ached, and the gash in his leg throbbed. "Sure. Any chance I can scavenge my ship?" She pursed her lips. "Perhaps, but it is likely that scavengers have already descended on the crash site. We will have to be careful." He didn't relish the idea of facing scavengers, but he needed the tools, especially if he had any hope of salvaging a distress beacon. He gathered his things, offering her a grateful nod. "Lead the way." They ventured back into the dunes, the sky a hazy gold. The planet's star hovered low on the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the sands. The wind picked up again, swirling dust devils in the distance. Lirae moved with a quiet grace, her senses attuned to the subtle changes in the terrain. Rylan found himself struggling to keep up, though he was determined not to show weakness. They crested a ridge, overlooking the wreck. His heart sank. Indeed, a group of humanoid scavengers, faces hidden behind tattered masks, picked through the remains. He counted 4. They carried makeshift rifles, and one was prying open the cargo hold with a crowbar. Sparks flew, metal protesting. He crouched beside Lirae, scanning the scene. "If they take everything, I'm done for," he murmured. She narrowed her eyes. "They may not leave you alive if they discover you, but I have an idea." She rested a hand on the sand, closing her eyes. He watched, confused, as she hummed a soft, vibrating note that resonated through her palm. The dunes around them seemed to quiver. In the distance, he saw a subtle shift, like a wave traveling beneath the surface. He exhaled in surprise. "What are you doing?" She didn't open her eyes. "We are in a region where the planet's energy veins run shallow. I can coax a small quake to unsettle them, if only to create a distraction." The note she hummed changed pitch, and the ground trembled faintly beneath them. Rylan watched in awe as the scavengers below stumbled, cursing in alarm. The cargo hold crowbar clattered to the sand. A chunk of metal fell from the ship with a crash. Rylan took the chance to slip down the ridge, keeping low. He gestured for Lirae to stay back. She gave him a measured look, but nodded. He crept toward the wreck, using the confusion to his advantage. The scavengers were busy trying to steady themselves. He reached the side of the craft, heart pounding. The twisted hull provided cover. He ducked behind a jagged sheet of metal, scanning for anything useful. The storage compartment was open, but the main console might still be intact. He spotted it near the cockpit, half buried in sand. One of the scavengers noticed him. "Hey!" The masked figure raised a rifle. Rylan dove for cover, cursing under his breath. Another quake rattled the area, courtesy of Lirae, and the scavenger lost his footing, the shot going wide. Rylan seized the moment, lunging to grab the rifle. He wrenched it away, knocking the scavenger off balance. A swift elbow to the temple sent the attacker sprawling. Two more turned on him, leveling their weapons. Rylan ducked behind the hull again, panting. Suddenly, a sharp hum pierced the air. Lirae vaulted over the ridge of the ship, her curved blade flashing in the morning light. With a swift, fluid motion, she disarmed one scavenger, sending the rifle clattering to the ground. The other swung a club at her, but she moved like water, twisting aside. Rylan leapt forward, tackling the second attacker. Sand flew in every direction as they wrestled. He pinned the scavenger's arm, and Lirae pressed the blade to the attacker's throat, her violet eyes cold. "Leave!" she commanded. The scavengers, seeing their advantage lost, scrambled to flee, dragging their unconscious companion away. Soon the dunes swallowed them, and all that remained was the battered wreck. Rylan stood there, breathing hard. He noticed Lirae's chest rising and falling quickly, adrenaline coursing through them both. She wiped sweat from her brow, a few strands of black-violet hair clinging to her cheek. He realized he was staring, that his heart was pounding not just from the fight. He forced himself to focus. "Thank you," he managed, voice rough. She sheathed her blade. "I did not save you for the second time just to have you die at the hands of fools," she said, though her tone carried a hint of dry humor. He nodded, offering a slight grin. "Right. Well, thanks anyway." He limped over to the cockpit, prying it open with a grunt of effort. The main console was cracked, but the emergency beacon might still be salvageable. He rummaged through the wires, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. Finally, he extracted a small palm-sized device. Its screen was shattered, but the core might be intact. He tapped the power cell. It flickered, then died. "Damn it," he muttered. "I need a new power source." Lirae crouched beside him, eyeing the device. "My people's settlements have energy nodes that might help, but we cannot simply walk into them." She paused, brushing a strand of hair behind one ear. "At least, I cannot. And you are an outsider. This is complicated." He set the beacon down, frustration coursing through him. "I'll figure something out. Maybe I can rig it to another power cell if I find one." He took a moment to look at her. "Why can't you return to your people? If they have the technology I need, we could go together." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I am not just anyone. My family is the ruling house, the Vekathra line. I was to be wed in a political alliance that would secure a trade route, but I discovered things, a corruption in the ranks, a willingness to sacrifice lives for power. I refused. My own cousin betrayed me, calling me a traitor to our house. I fled. There are those who would rather see me dead than let me disrupt their plans." He let out a low whistle, adjusting his stance. "An heiress, huh? That's definitely above my pay grade. But if your people have a settlement that can fix this beacon, maybe there's a way we can sneak in. You must know some routes or contacts." She hesitated, her violet gaze drifting over the dunes. "Perhaps, but it will not be simple. My face is known, and your presence will not go unnoticed." He glanced at the half-buried cargo. "We can't stay out here. The ship's unsalvageable. There's got to be a plan, unless you prefer we keep wandering until the storms get us." Her jaw tightened. No, I have a contact, an old caretaker who once served my family. He might still be loyal. He lives on the outskirts of the city of Tira, but that is deep into contested territory. Rylan carefully tested the scavenged rifle. It had a few shots left. Better than nothing. Contested by whom? She looked away. Several factions, some loyal to my family, others loyal to rival houses. They all want control of Veshareth's resources. Tira is a central hub of trade, but it is also a hotbed of spies and mercenaries. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. Sounds like a party. Let's do it. He realized how cavalier that might sound. I mean, unless you have a better idea. She exhaled. No, we need that power source, and I need to stop running. If we can expose the corruption, maybe we can end this conflict before it tears my people apart. He nodded. Then let's get moving. They salvaged what they could. A small ration pack, a canteen, and a few pieces of scrap metal Rylan thought might come in handy. Lirae took a moment to hum softly against a fractured panel, reading the planet's energy veins to see if the route ahead was stable. She explained that Veshareth's subterranean pulses shifted with the tectonic plates, creating pockets of unstable gravity that could tear a traveler apart if they weren't careful. He listened in fascination, impressed by her unique skill. As they set off, he felt the jacket slung over his arm and realized Lirae had never really kept it. She had used it briefly, but she handed it back. He found himself wondering if it was a point of pride, or if she simply didn't want to owe him anything. He decided not to press. Instead, he followed her lead, occasionally tapping his fingers in a rhythmic pattern against his thigh, a nervous habit he'd had since his days as a pilot. She noticed once or twice, her gaze flicking to his fingers, but she said nothing. They made their way across a region of rocky outcrops. Here, the sand gave way to smooth, dark stone that shimmered as though polished. He saw veins of color swirling beneath the surface, faint and mesmerizing, like ribbons of molten ore. Lirae explained that these stones were prized for their resonance properties, capable of storing energy. He realized how crucial these resources must be in powering their technology. He also realized how valuable they would be on the galactic market, which explained the intense political struggles. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, scorching the land. Rylan felt sweat bead on his forehead. Lirae seemed accustomed to the heat, but even she was slowing. He offered her water from the canteen. She took a small sip, then handed it back, caution in her eyes. They needed to ration. He saw the worry lines etched in her face, realized she was no longer the aloof figure who had threatened him with a blade. There was tension in her posture, but also a certain vulnerability he hadn't seen before. They paused at midday beneath a natural arch of stone that provided some shade. Rylan's leg wound, throbbed, so he finally peeled back the torn fabric to examine it. Lirae frowned, kneeling beside him. "You are hurt more than you let on." He tried to wave it off. "I've had worse. I'll manage." She pressed her hand lightly against his calf, sending a jolt of pain through him. He hissed. "That's deep," she said. "It could become infected." He shrugged. "No med kit. I'll just have to keep it clean." She studied the wound, then rummaged through a small pouch at her belt. She withdrew a tiny packet of fine powder. "This is a mineral salve. It will sting, but it will help." She sprinkled it onto the cut, and he clenched his teeth as a burning sensation spread through his flesh. He noticed she hummed softly, that same harmonic resonance. The pain seemed to lessen, and the bleeding slowed. She exhaled, leaning back. "That should suffice for now." He tested his leg, nodding. "Thank you. That's 2 times you've saved me today. I'm starting to think I owe you." She didn't smile, but he saw a flicker of warmth in her expression. "Your presence is not entirely a burden," she said, almost teasing. "You did fight well back there." He smirked. "High praise." He glanced away, tapping his fingers against the stone. She caught the motion and gave him a curious look. "That habit, why do you do it?" He shrugged. I used to pilot cargo ships, long journeys through uncharted space. I'd get bored or anxious, and I'd tap out the routes on the console. My own little pattern. Now I do it without thinking. She nodded thoughtfully. I hum. I have since I was a child. My caretaker said I had a gift for resonance, that my voice could soothe the planet's rhythms. Perhaps that is why I can manipulate the energy fields. He felt a spark of connection in the sharing of these small quirks, the quiet revelations of who they were beneath the survival instincts. He found himself wanting to know more about her, but he wasn't sure if she wanted to share. They pressed on. By late afternoon, the terrain shifted again, revealing jagged spires of dark rock, as if a giant hand had thrust them up from the depths. Lirae paused, frowning. We must be cautious here. The gravity pockets are stronger among these formations. Rylan nodded. Lead the way. He soon realized the danger. With each step, he felt the weight of his body fluctuate, sometimes growing heavier, sometimes lighter, as though invisible hands were tugging him up or down. Lirae guided him carefully, placing her palm against certain rocks and humming softly to gauge the stability. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. As they maneuvered through a narrow gap, the rock walls towered overhead, their surfaces shimmering with hidden patterns that reminded him of a swirling night sky. Suddenly, the ground rumbled. A deep crack opened in the path behind them, swallowing a section of rock with a thunderous roar. Rylan's heart pounded as dust filled the air. He grabbed Lirae's arm to steady himself, and she steadied him in turn. We have to keep moving, she urged, voice tense. They hurried forward, the quake subsiding. But the passage was unstable now, small rocks tumbling around them. At one point, a boulder shifted overhead, threatening to crush them. Lirae pressed her hands against the stone, humming a frantic, urgent note. Rylan felt the air tremble. The boulder seemed to hover for a heartbeat, enough for him to yank her aside. It crashed to the ground with a deafening thud, sending a cloud of debris swirling. He coughed, blinking grit from his eyes. Lirae looked pale, her silver-veined temples glistening with sweat. He realized the effort of controlling the resonance was draining her. You all right? He asked, voice rough. She nodded, but her breath was ragged. I will manage. He gently took her arm, guiding her over the rubble. They emerged from the passage onto a plateau that overlooked a vast desert plain. In the distance, Rylan could make out the faint outline of a city, dark spires rising against the horizon, bathed in the molten orange of the setting sun. He saw flickers of light that could be energy fields, or perhaps torches along the walls. That must be Keith Tira, he said softly. She nodded, eyes fixed on the city. There was a heaviness in her expression. Yes, it has been many months since I last saw it. He gazed at the distant structures, a pang of concern gnawing at him. We can rest for a moment here. You look exhausted. She let out a weary breath. I suppose a short rest would be wise. They found a small alcove sheltered by a natural overhang of stone. Rylan rummaged through the ration pack, offering her a small portion of dried food. She took it gratefully. The wind was calmer here, the evening light painting her lavender skin in soft hues of gold and purple. He found himself momentarily captivated by the way her eyes caught the light, the shifting ember tones reflecting some inner fire. She noticed him staring and tilted her head slightly. You are staring, Rylan. He cleared his throat, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. Sorry, it's just everything here is so different from what I'm used to. She gave a small, almost teasing smirk. Is it my ears that fascinate you, or my eyes, or something else? There was a slight edge of challenge in her voice, as though daring him to speak plainly. He felt a jolt of embarrassment, but also something else, an unexpected pull. He managed a crooked smile. I mean, your ears are definitely unique, but your eyes, too. They're beautiful. She blinked, as though unused to such direct compliments. For a moment, her cool composure wavered. Then she looked away. Human flattery, she murmured. I do not hear it often, but thank you. He settled back, letting silence drape over them. The tension between them was tangible, yet neither made a move to break it. Finally, she spoke again, her tone quieter. "Why did you really crash here? You said it was a navigational error, but I sense there is more to your story." He pressed his lips together. "I was ferrying cargo for a small outfit. But, truth is, I was trying to outrun my past. I was part of a mission that went bad. My crew was ambushed, and I was the only survivor. I blame myself for not seeing the trap sooner. Ever since I've been drifting, taking whatever jobs I can, always looking over my shoulder." He paused, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "It's like I'm waiting for the universe to punish me for messing up, and maybe this crash is it." She listened, eyes reflecting sympathy. "That is a heavy burden to carry alone." He shrugged. "Well, now I'm not alone, at least. I've got an alien heiress to keep me on my toes." He tried to inject some humor, but the words hung in the air with a certain rawness. She lowered her gaze. "I am not sure I want to be that heiress anymore. It is a title that chains me. But you do not deserve to be punished for a tragedy that was not entirely your fault." He felt something shift inside him at her gentle words. He reached out, lightly brushing her hand with his fingertips. She didn't pull away. "Thanks," he said softly. "And you don't deserve to be forced into something you don't want either." They shared a quiet moment, the desert wind rustling around them. He realized his heart was pounding. He wanted to say more, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, she squeezed his hand, just briefly before withdrawing. The simple gesture spoke volumes, though. It felt like the first genuine moment of understanding between them, something deeper than survival or necessity. They rose as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in shades of blue and silver. The night sky unfurled overhead, revealing unfamiliar constellations. Lirae led him carefully down the plateau, using her resonance sense to guide them away from gravitational pockets. The city of Tira drew closer, its walls becoming more distinct in the moonlight. Rylan noticed tall spires topped with what looked like rotating crystals that refracted light in dancing patterns across the sky. As they approached the outskirts, the wind carried the distant sounds of bustling streets, clanking machinery, and the hum of energy fields. Lirae gestured for Rylan to keep close. They slipped into a narrow alley formed by ancient stone structures. The walls were etched with intricate designs, swirling motifs reminiscent of the planet's shifting energies. He could feel a low thrum beneath his feet, as though the city itself was alive with a pulse that matched the planet's core. They found an abandoned courtyard near the edge of the city, partially collapsed buildings offering some cover. Lirae paused at a rusted metal gate, pressing her ear against it. Satisfied no one was around, she slipped inside. Rylan followed. Noticing the architecture was old, the arches chipped and worn. Vines with shimmering leaves clung to the walls, their surfaces reflecting starlight in a faint glimmer. She led him to a recessed door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "My caretaker, old Maven, used to live here," she whispered, "but I do not know if he remains." She tested the handle. Locked. Rylan fiddled with it, pulling out a small multi-tool from his pocket. With careful prying, he managed to trip the mechanism. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty corridor. The air inside was stale, but it bore a hint of familiarity for Lirae, judging by the way her eyes darted around with cautious hope. They stepped inside, and she called out softly, "Maven, it is Lirae." Her voice echoed. No reply came. She glanced at Rylan, disappointment etched in her features. They explored further, stepping over broken furniture and scattered belongings. It looked as though the place had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, the floor littered with papers. Lirae knelt to pick up a torn piece of cloth that might have once been a tapestry. She ran her fingers over it, sadness flickering in her eyes. Rylan checked a small workshop area. To his surprise, he found a half-functional generator, though it looked ancient. "Hey," he called softly, "this might help power the beacon if I can get it working." She hurried over, glancing at the device. Maven was always tinkering with old machines. He believed in merging resonance with technology. Perhaps he left something behind that we can use. Rylan nodded, already examining the generator's wiring. I need a stable power cell, or at least something I can rig to the beacon. Let's see. He crouched down, tapping his fingers against the metal in that rhythmic pattern. Lirae watched him, her expression shifting from sorrow to curiosity. He tried the switch. The generator coughed, a feeble sputter of energy flickering along a coil. Not enough juice, he muttered. But maybe if we combine it with the resonance crystals you mentioned, we can amplify the output. She pursed her lips, glancing around. There should be a small cache of them in the next room, if they haven't been taken. She moved to a door at the back of the workshop, pushing it open with a groan of old hinges. Rylan followed, shining a small flashlight. They found a chest, its lock broken. Inside were a few shards of dull crystal, chipped and scratched. Lirae picked one up, holding it to her ear. She hummed, a gentle note that made the shard tremble with faint energy. They are damaged, but perhaps still usable. He grinned. Let's give it a shot. He carried the crystals back to the generator, hooking up a makeshift array. Lirae hovered close, her presence a quiet encouragement. He glanced at her, meeting her eyes in the dim light. Come for me, he said softly, feeling an odd flush at the intimacy of the request. She nodded, setting a hand on the crystals. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, and then began a low melody that vibrated in her throat. Rylan felt the air change. A subtle, pulsing energy moved through the crystals, bridging the broken wires. He flipped the switch. The generator sparked to life, a soft hum filling the workshop. A small surge of light illuminated the gloom. He let out a triumphant laugh. It's working, enough to power the beacon at least. She opened her eyes, smiling faintly, though she looked a bit drained. You see, your mechanical skill and my resonance can accomplish more together than apart. He felt a sudden urge to take her hand, to express gratitude for more than just her help. But before he could act on it, a noise echoed from the corridor. They froze. Footsteps approached, accompanied by a low hiss of a voice. Rylan instinctively raised the scavenged rifle. Lirae tensed, blade at the ready. A figure emerged from the shadows, elderly and stooped, wearing a patched cloak. His eyes went wide when he saw them. Rylan lowered his weapon, and Lirae let out a breath. Maven, she whispered, stepping forward. The old caretaker blinked, recognition dawning in his wrinkled face. My lady, he croaked. You live. She rushed to him, grasping his hands. I came here hoping to find you, or at least some clue. I thought you might be. Her voice faltered, and the old man patted her hand gently. I fled when the city guard came. They were looking for you. I hid in the old tunnels beneath this district. He eyed Rylan warily. Who is this human? Lirae glanced at Rylan, a flicker of something crossing her face. Gratitude, fondness, maybe more. He is Rylan. He crashed here. We have been helping each other survive. Maven nodded, though distrust lingered in his eyes. I see. Come with me. The city has grown more dangerous since you left, my lady. They followed him into a hidden basement, accessible by a trapdoor in the workshop floor. It was cramped, musty, but surprisingly well-stocked with food, water, and an old cot. Maven explained that he'd been living there in hiding, gathering information. Your cousin, Lord Kelteth, has seized power in your absence, he told Lirae, voice trembling with anger. He claims you are a traitor, that you conspired to sabotage the alliance. He has the city guard under his command, along with hired mercenaries. Lirae's expression hardened. I suspected as much. He never wanted the alliance for peace, only for control of the resource trade. Rylan listened, uneasy. And these mercenaries, they might be the ones who set those scavengers on me, or maybe they're behind some bigger plan. Is there a chance they're the reason you got forced out? Maven nodded grimly. Yes, my lady was to be wed to the son of a rival house, which would have brought peace and mutual trade. Kelteth saw an opportunity to sabotage the arrangement, to incite conflict so he could consolidate power. When Lirae refused to go along, he branded her a traitor. Lirae's hands curled into fists. "I won't let him destroy my people for his greed." Rylan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll stop him, but we need help." Maevin sighed. "There are still those loyal to the Vekathra line. If we can get word to them, show proof of Kelteth's corruption, they might rise against him. But we must be careful." Rylan reached into his pack, producing the broken beacon. "First, I need to fix this, or we'll never get off-world. We need the city's power nodes, or something more stable than that generator upstairs. If we can broadcast a signal, we might also reach any off-world allies." Maven frowned. "Kelteth controls most of the power stations now, but there is one on the outskirts, near the old catacombs. It's risky, but we might bypass the guards if we go through the underground passages." Lirae set her jaw. "Then that is what we'll do. Maven, will you come with us?" The caretaker hesitated, his frail frame trembling. "I am old, my lady, but I will do what I can. My loyalty is to your family, always." They spent the next hour planning. Rylan and Lirae took the chance to rest, sipping water from Maven's stores. At one point, Lirae caught Rylan's eye, and he felt a tug of something between them. Shared determination, yes, but also a warmth that went beyond mere alliance. He thought of how she'd saved him, how he'd offered her his jacket, how they'd begun to confide in each other. In the flickering lamplight of the cramped basement, her features were softened by shadow. She seemed to sense his thoughts, a slight tilt of her lips hinting at a shy smile. Once Maven dozed off, exhausted by the excitement of their arrival, Rylan and Lirae found themselves alone in a corner of the room, the quiet hum of the city's distant bustle filtering through the walls. He noticed the tension in her shoulders, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Gently, he reached out and placed a hand over hers. She turned her palm to intertwine her fingers with his. The simple contact felt electric, an unspoken admission that they were more than just allies now. He spoke softly, mindful not to wake Maven. "I'm sorry you have to face your cousin like this. Family betrayals, they cut deep." She squeezed his hand. "Yes, but at least I'm not alone." Her gaze flicked to his face, her violet eyes reflecting a tenderness he hadn't seen before. "You have risked much by staying with me." He shook his head. "You saved my life and I—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I guess I've been running from my past for so long it feels different to finally stand and fight for something, or someone." Her expression softened, and she leaned closer. The warmth of her breath teased against his cheek. For a moment, he thought she might kiss him, but a clatter from Maven's direction made them both pull away, hearts pounding. She let out a soft exhale, and he gave her a rueful smile. It was a moment suspended between them, an almost confession of deeper feelings that neither had fully voiced yet. Night wore on, and eventually they settled down to sleep in cramped quarters, the caretaker on the cot, Rylan and Lirae finding space on the floor. He removed his jacket and offered it again, draping it over her as she lay down. This time she didn't refuse. She tucked it around her shoulders, her eyes fluttering shut. He lay beside her, careful not to crowd her, but unable to ignore the subtle warmth of her body. When he closed his eyes, he could still sense her presence, the faint hum of her breath, the memory of her hand in his. He drifted into a restless sleep, his mind swirling with thoughts of the mission ahead and the unspoken longing between them. At dawn, they woke to Maven gently shaking them. "We must go now, before the patrols become active," he said. They gathered their supplies and slipped out of the workshop into the maze of back alleys. The caretaker led them through twisting corridors, some partially collapsed. The architecture here was older, with walls that bore the scars of time. Rylan noticed scrawled graffiti, symbols he didn't understand, perhaps belonging to different factions vying for control. Occasionally, they heard distant voices or the clank of boots on cobblestone, forcing them to hide until the guards passed. Eventually, they reached a rusted gate that led underground. Maven pulled a lever hidden behind a broken statue, and the gate slid open with a groan. Stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of earth and mildew. Lirae took the lead, humming softly to sense any gravitational anomalies below. They descended a spiral staircase carved into stone, lit only by a few flickering torches left by someone else. The catacombs were damp, the walls slick with condensation. Ancient runes and carvings lined the passage, telling stories of Vekathra royalty from centuries past. Rylan felt a chill, both from the cold and the weight of history pressing in. Maven explained in hushed tones that these tunnels once served as burial chambers for noble families. Many had been sealed off, but the caretaker knew secret routes that led near the power station. They navigated labyrinthine corridors, passing crypts sealed with heavy stone doors. Occasionally, they heard distant skittering, but no immediate threats. The tension mounted as they pressed deeper. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a wide chamber with a vaulted ceiling. Cracks in the stone allowed faint beams of daylight to filter in, illuminating swirling dust motes. In the center of the chamber, a collapsed pillar created a ramp to an upper level. Lirae paused, placing a hand on the floor. She hummed quietly, then frowned. There is a resonance shift above. I sense activity, machines, or something akin to them. Rylan hefted the rifle. Might be a patrol, or the power station security systems. Maven nodded gravely. We must be cautious. The station is just beyond this chamber. If we can reach the main generator, you can power your beacon, but Kelteth's guards may be there. They climbed the collapsed pillar, emerging onto a narrow ledge. Rylan peered over the edge. The station was built into the underground structure, a series of large pylons connected by cables that hummed with energy. A group of armed soldiers patrolled the area, wearing dark uniforms emblazoned with a crest that looked suspiciously like the Vekathra insignia, only altered. Rylan glanced at Lirae, who set her jaw in anger. "That crest," she whispered. "He has taken our family's symbol and twisted it for his own faction. We must be swift. If they spot me—" He nodded. "We'll need a distraction." He surveyed the station. The main console was at the far end, near a large cylindrical device thrumming with power. If he could access that console, he could siphon enough energy to power the beacon. But the soldiers were spread out, about 6 of them, all armed. Lirae's gaze flicked to a series of pipes running along the ceiling. If I can create a resonant surge in those pipes, it might cause a small explosion, or at least a burst of steam to draw them away. Rylan grimaced. "Are you sure you're up for that? You looked pretty drained last time." She nodded firmly. "I will do what must be done." She turned to Maven. "Stay here. Keep out of sight. Rylan and I will move to the console." The caretaker's eyes were full of worry, but he nodded. "Be careful, my lady." They crept along the ledge until they were directly above the pipes. Lirae placed her palms against the metal. Rylan saw the tension in her shoulders, the concentration on her face. She hummed a low note that vibrated through the structure. At first, nothing happened. Then a series of clangs echoed through the chamber, followed by a sudden jet of steam erupting from a rupture. The guards shouted in alarm, rushing to investigate the malfunction. Rylan seized the moment, motioning for Lirae to follow him. They slid down a pile of debris, landing behind a large pylon. The hum of energy was almost deafening at this proximity. He peeked around the corner. The console was only 20 feet away, but a lone guard still stood nearby, weapon at the ready. Rylan signaled Lirae to stay put. He crept closer, keeping low behind a row of conduits. The guard, distracted by the chaos, never saw him coming. Rylan struck swiftly, knocking the guard out with a blow to the back of the head. The man crumpled silently. Rylan grabbed the rifle, tossing it aside. Then he waved Lirae over. She joined him at the console, breathing heavily. He could see the strain of her resonant surge had taken a toll. Just a bit longer. he said softly, pulling the beacon from his pack. He pried open the console's access panel, hooking wires into the beacon's power cell. Sparks flew, and a whine of protest came from the station's readout. He cursed under his breath. "I need to stabilize the output. The feedback is too high." Lirae pressed her hand against the console, humming a gentler note. The readouts flickered, the energy levels smoothing. Rylan's eyes widened in admiration. "You can calm machines too," she managed a tired smile. "Machines here rely on the same resonance as the planet. It's all connected." He flicked a switch on the beacon, and a soft glow lit the small screen. It was battered, but it powered up. He set it to broadcast a wide distress signal, hoping some passing vessel might pick it up. He typed in the frequency. The screen blinked, indicating it was transmitting. Relief surged through him. "That should do it," he breathed. "Now let's get out of—" Alarms blared, lights flashing across the station. A harsh voice echoed through the chamber. "Intruders detected. Secure the area." The guards who had rushed to the pipes were now spinning around, guns drawn, scanning for the source of the infiltration. Rylan yanked the beacon free, shoving it into his bag. "We have to move." Lirae stumbled slightly, the exertion evident on her face. He caught her arm, guiding her behind a large power coil. Gunfire erupted, bullets ricocheting off the metal. She gasped, pressing a hand to her side. He saw a trickle of blood on her fingers. "No," he whispered, panic flaring. "You're hit?" She grimaced. "A graze, I think. Keep moving." Her voice was tight with pain but resolute. He helped her along, trying to circle back to where Maven was hiding. Another burst of gunfire forced them to dive behind a console. Lirae leaned against it, breathing heavily. He clenched his jaw. "We need a bigger distraction." His gaze fell on a cluster of unstable power couplings across the station. If he could overload them, it might buy them time to escape. He turned to Lirae. "Can you do one more surge, something that'll blow those couplings?" She nodded, though her eyes were lidded with exhaustion. "Yes. Just help me focus." He wrapped an arm around her waist, steadying her. She closed her eyes, humming a building note that climbed in intensity. He felt the hairs on his arms stand up as the air crackled with energy. The couplings sparked, arcs of electricity dancing across them. The guards shouted in alarm, diving for cover. Then a deafening crack tore through the chamber as the couplings overloaded. A fiery blast of energy erupted, sending debris flying. The entire station shook, lights flickering wildly. Rylan shielded Lirae with his body from the worst of the blast. The heat singed his arms, and he heard the station's machinery groan in protest. He coughed, eyes stinging from the smoke. The guards were scattered, some unconscious, others pinned by debris. "Now!" he urged, pulling Lirae to her feet. They dashed back the way they came, half running, half stumbling. Maven emerged from his hiding spot, eyes wide with fear. "Hurry!" he cried. They clambered back into the catacombs, the caretaker leading them through twisting passages as the alarms faded behind them. The path seemed endless, their lungs burning, until finally they reached a small grate that opened onto a deserted alley in the city's lower district. They collapsed onto the cobblestones, panting. Lirae clutched her side, blood staining her fingers. Rylan tore a strip from his shirt, pressing it to her wound. "Stay with me," he said, voice laced with worry. She nodded, eyes fluttering. Maven stood guard, scanning the alley for threats. For a moment, Rylan and Lirae locked gazes, the fear and adrenaline forging an almost desperate intimacy between them. He cupped her cheek gently. "We got the beacon powered. Now we just have to hold out until someone picks up the signal." She managed a shaky smile. "You have done well, Rylan." His heart pounded. He leaned in, brushing his lips against her forehead, then her temple. She let out a trembling breath, turning her face to meet his. Their lips touched in a tender, breathless kiss, born of relief and shared danger. The world seemed to still, just for that moment, as if everything else faded into the background. She tasted of sweat and dust, and he savored the raw honesty of it, the fragile connection forged in the heat of battle. He pulled back gently, cradling her face. "You'll be all right," he murmured, more a promise than a question. She nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "We cannot stay here," she whispered. "Kelteth's forces will be searching." Maven cleared his throat. "I know a place in the outskirts where we can hide, but we must hurry." They helped Lirae to her feet. She leaned on Rylan, wincing with each step. He guided her through the winding alleys, Maven leading the way. Eventually they reached a dilapidated structure that had once been a storehouse. The caretaker unlocked a hidden door, revealing a small room stocked with medical supplies. Rylan carefully lowered Lirae onto a makeshift cot, quickly setting to work cleaning and bandaging her wound. She gritted her teeth against the pain. He stroked her hair, murmuring words of comfort. "Just breathe. You're safe now." He felt an odd surge of protectiveness, the same sensation that had driven him to offer her his jacket that first night in the desert. She was fierce, regal, yet vulnerable in this moment, and he realized how deeply he cared for her. She closed her eyes, her body relaxing slightly under his touch. Maven busied himself checking the perimeter. The old caretaker seemed oddly energized by the events, as though renewed by having a purpose. Rylan stayed by Lirae's side, eventually fetching water for her to drink. She swallowed gratefully, color returning to her cheeks. After a while, her eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. When he was certain she was resting, Rylan stepped outside for a moment, leaning against the wall of the storehouse. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark blonde hair, which was matted with sweat and dust. His ribs ached and the cut on his leg throbbed, but his thoughts were on Lirae. In a short span of time, she'd become someone he couldn't imagine abandoning. He thought of her determination, her willingness to fight for her people despite the betrayal of her own family. He felt a pang of admiration, laced with fear for what lay ahead. He took out the beacon, checking its small screen. The transmission was still broadcasting, though he had no idea if anyone was receiving. The possibility of rescue felt both vital and uncertain. A small beep signaled that the battery was draining fast. He cursed under his breath. They'd need more power if they wanted to keep it running long enough for a ship to pick it up. But for now, he had to focus on Lirae's recovery and figuring out how to deal with Kelteth. Hours passed. He re-entered the room to find Lirae awake, sipping water. She gave him a tired smile. "I'm alive, it seems." He knelt beside her. "You gave me a scare. How do you feel?" She grimaced. "Weak, but the bleeding has stopped." "Thank you." She looked down, her expression turning pensive. "I keep thinking, if I had never left, maybe I could have prevented all this." He shook his head firmly. "You couldn't have known the extent of Kelteth's plans. You did what you had to do. Don't blame yourself." She reached out, taking his hand in hers. The contact sent a comforting warmth through him. "Thank you," she repeated softly, and he understood she meant for more than just the bandages. That evening, with Lirae stabilized, Rylan and Maven quietly discussed their next steps in another corner of the storehouse. Maven insisted that if they could gather proof of Kelteth's crimes, his deals with mercenaries, the sabotage of the Alliance, then many of the city's citizens and even other noble houses would rally behind Lirae. The caretaker believed there was a secret ledger kept in the old palace archives which recorded all official dealings. If Kelteth had forged documents or made illegal deals, the proof would be there. Rylan eyed the caretaker skeptically. "Breaking into the palace archives sounds suicidal. We barely escaped the power station." Maven wrung his hands. "Yes, but the archives are in the older wing, less guarded. Kelteth is more concerned with the throne room and the treasury. If we move carefully..." Lirae, who had been listening, struggled to sit up. "I must go. I know the palace better than anyone. I can navigate the hidden passages." Rylan shook his head. "You're still injured." She set her jaw stubbornly. "I am not helpless, and I will not send you in there without me." He knew better than to argue with that tone. "All right, but you stay behind me, and we move slowly." Maven outlined the route, describing an entrance through the palace's undercroft. Once they had the ledger, they could broadcast the evidence through the city's public frequency. Kelteth would be exposed, and hopefully the people would rise up. It was a risky plan, but it was all they had. They rested until nightfall, tension coiled in the air. Rylan and Lirae shared a quiet meal of dried fruits and flatbread, the caretaker's provisions. At one point their hands brushed, and she glanced at him with a small smile, the momentary tenderness a balm to the stress of their predicament. He leaned close, his voice low. "We'll get through this." She nodded, eyes shining with determination. Yes, together. When darkness fell, they set out, Lirae leaning on Rylan for support. Maven led the way through winding alleys until they reached the palace district, a grand edifice rising against the starry sky. The palace walls were carved from the same dark stone as the rest of the city, but adorned with swirling inlays of precious minerals that reflected the faint starlight in shimmering patterns. Towers and spires rose high, each topped with a crystal that refracted light in graceful arcs. It would have been beautiful if not for the tension and danger that lurked within. They slipped around the perimeter, evading patrols. Lirae guided them to a hidden door near the base of a tower. She hummed a soft note, and a faint resonance in the stone revealed a hidden latch. The door slid open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into the undercroft. Torches burned at intervals, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Rylan kept the rifle ready, his heart pounding. They reached a corridor lined with arches, the floor damp with condensation. A sense of history clung to the air. Lirae whispered directions, leading them through twisting hallways until they emerged into a wide corridor with ornate pillars. She gestured to a set of heavy doors at the far end. "The archives are through there," she breathed. Maven nodded, stepping forward cautiously. Rylan scanned the corridor. 2 guards stood by the doors, wearing the altered Vekathra crest. Lirae frowned, leaning against the wall. She looked pale, the exertion taking its toll. Rylan gently touched her arm. "You rest. I'll handle them." She started to protest, but he pressed a finger to her lips. "Just for once, let me protect you." Her eyes flickered with conflicting emotions. Pride, frustration, gratitude. She nodded reluctantly. Rylan handed Maven his pistol. "If anything goes wrong, get her out." The caretaker nodded, clutching the weapon with trembling hands. Rylan crept down the corridor, sticking to the shadows. The guards chatted quietly, oblivious to his approach. He crouched behind a pillar, waiting for the right moment. When one guard turned away, Rylan sprang, slamming the butt of his rifle into the other guard's head. The man crumpled. The second guard whirled, raising his weapon, but Rylan lunged, grabbing the barrel. They struggled, the guard trying to pull the trigger. Rylan twisted the rifle free, smashing it into the guard's temple. The man collapsed, unconscious. He motioned for Lirae and Maven to follow. They hurried to the doors, pushing them open. Inside was a grand library of sorts, shelves upon shelves of scrolls and ledgers. A large table stood in the center, scattered with documents. Lirae scanned the shelves. "Look for the official ledger of transactions," she whispered, voice tight with pain. Maven rummaged through the piles on the table, while Rylan searched the shelves, mindful of any hidden compartments. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. Lirae sank into a chair, clutching her side, eyes squeezed shut against the discomfort. Rylan threw worried glances her way, but he knew they had to find that ledger quickly. Finally, Maven let out a triumphant gasp. "Here, I believe this is it." He held up a thick tome bound in worn leather. Lirae forced herself to her feet, leaning on the table for support. She flipped through the pages, scanning them. Her face darkened with anger. "Look, entries for illegal weapons sales, bribes, all authorized by Kelteth, forging my father's signature. This is the proof we need." Rylan allowed himself a small breath of relief. "Then let's get out of here and broadcast it." They gathered the ledger, stuffing it into a satchel. As they turned to leave, footsteps pounded in the corridor. Rylan froze. "We have to hide," he hissed. But it was too late. A squad of guards, led by a tall figure with sharp features, stormed into the archives. At the sight of Lirae, the man's lips curved in a cruel smile. "Kelteth," she spat, eyes blazing with hatred. Her cousin regarded her with mock surprise. "Dearest Lirae, I had almost believed you dead. What a pleasant surprise that you are not." His gaze flicked to the ledger in her satchel. "Though I see you've been snooping, hand that over." Rylan stepped protectively in front of her, rifle raised. Kelteth snorted. "A human pet? How quaint. Guards, seize them." The guards aimed their weapons. Rylan's heart thundered. He had only a few shots left. Lirae, summoning the last of her strength, placed a hand on his shoulder. He felt a faint vibration through his body, as though her resonance was flowing into him. The lights in the room flickered, crystals embedded in the walls pulsing. The guards hesitated, eyes darting around in confusion. Kelteth snarled. "Shoot them!" Rylan fired first, taking down 2 guards. Maven ducked behind a shelf. Lirae hummed a piercing note, the resonance causing the guards' weapons to spark. Some dropped their rifles in alarm, the metal scalding hot. Rylan took advantage, lunging at another guard, striking him down. Kelteth, however, remained calm, pulling a sleek energy blade from his belt. He advanced on Lirae, eyes gleaming with malice. "You always were too stubborn for your own good," he hissed, slashing at her. She stumbled back, barely blocking the blow with her own blade. Sparks flew as the blades met. Rylan tried to intervene, but 2 more guards tackled him, wrestling him to the ground. He struggled, rage surging in his veins as he watched Kelteth corner Lirae. She was weakened, her earlier wound slowing her movements. Kelteth sneered, pressing his advantage. "You should have stayed in exile. Now you'll die here, and I'll cement my rule." He slashed again, slicing her shoulder. She cried out in pain, dropping to one knee. The ledger fell from her satchel, pages scattering. Rylan roared, elbowing one guard and headbutting the other. He rolled free, grabbing his rifle. Kelteth raised his blade for a killing blow. Lirae tried to raise her own weapon, but her arm trembled, blood running down her arm. In that instant, Rylan fired. The shot rang out, striking Kelteth's blade arm. He let out a howl, dropping the weapon. Lirae seized the moment, surging up despite her pain. She slashed across Kelteth's chest, and he staggered back, collapsing against a shelf with a look of utter shock. The remaining guards, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Rylan aimed his rifle at them. "Anyone else want to try?" he snarled. They glanced at each other, then dropped their weapons. Maven hurried to gather the ledger's pages, stuffing them back into the binding. Lirae stood over her cousin, breathing hard. He glared at her, clutching his bleeding chest. She lifted her chin, voice shaking with anger and hurt. "You would destroy our people for your own greed. No more." He coughed, spitting blood. "They'll never follow you," he rasped. She turned away, refusing to waste another word. Rylan stepped in, pressing the muzzle of his rifle to Kelteth's forehead. For a moment, rage burned in his eyes. He remembered all the pain this man had caused, the near-death experiences, the betrayal. Lirae placed a trembling hand on his arm. "No, enough blood. Let him live to face judgment." Rylan's breath caught, but he lowered the weapon. He helped Lirae, who was on the verge of collapsing, and together they left Kelteth to the guards' uncertain loyalties. Maven guided them through a side passage, the ledger clutched to his chest. Rylan practically carried Lirae as they made their escape. Her breathing was ragged, and she leaned heavily on him, eyes fluttering. They emerged into the palace courtyard, where the dawn light was just beginning to touch the spires. A group of citizens and lesser guards, alerted by the commotion, gathered at the sight of Lirae, battered and bloody, but defiant. Maven, his voice trembling, raised the ledger and shouted for all to hear, "Behold the proof of Kelteth's crimes. He has forged documents, made deals with mercenaries, and betrayed the Vacathra legacy." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some knelt in respect to Lirae, recognizing the rightful heir. Others stood in shock, uncertain. Rylan saw a few guards lower their weapons, shame evident on their faces. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a spark to ignite change. Just then, a crackle came from Rylan's bag. The beacon. He fumbled for it, seeing the screen blink with a weak signal. A voice emerged through the static. "This is the freighter Sun's Embrace, responding to a distress call on open frequency. We're picking up multiple transmissions from Caith Tira. Do you need assistance?" Relief flooded Rylan. "Yes," he replied into the beacon's mic. "We have wounded, and the city is in the midst of a power struggle. We need help evacuating or stabilizing the situation." The pilot of the Sun's Embrace promised to land outside the city walls. Citizens, hearing the off-world rescue, began to gather around, hope shining in their eyes. Lirae sagged against Rylan, her strength nearly spent. He brushed a strand of her black-violet hair from her face. "We did it," he murmured. "You exposed Keltith." She managed a faint smile, tears glistening. "I could not have done it alone." In the hours that followed, chaos and relief intermingled in the city. Loyalists to Lirae escorted them to a safe chamber within the palace, while word spread of Keltith's defeat. The ledger's contents were broadcast across the city, turning public opinion sharply against him. Some factions resisted, but the momentum for change was unstoppable. Rylan stayed close to Lirae, helping her as the palace medics tended her wounds. Maven oversaw the formalities, ensuring the people understood the truth of Keltith's treachery. By evening, the city had settled into a tense but hopeful calm. Keltith was imprisoned, awaiting trial. Many of his guards switched allegiance, claiming they had been misled. The people looked to Lirae for guidance, yet she found herself unsure if she wanted the throne. For now, she was content to see her cousin's tyranny ended. Rylan helped her to a balcony overlooking the city, the air cool against their faces. Lights shimmered across the rooftops, the gentle hum of resonance weaving through the night. He slipped an arm around her waist, mindful of her bandaged shoulder. She leaned into him, her head resting on his chest. Below, the citizens began lighting lanterns, sending them into the sky in a quiet celebration of hope. The sight was breathtaking, the lanterns drifting like glowing moths across the starlit backdrop. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple. "How are you feeling?" She sighed, a mix of weariness and peace. "Better, but my people will need strong leadership to rebuild. I'm not sure I can be that leader." He turned her gently to face him, looking into her eyes. "You already are. You fought for them, bled for them, exposed corruption. That's what real leaders do." She reached up, fingertips tracing the faint scar on his cheek. "You have given me strength. I am grateful." He felt his heart swell at the sincerity in her voice. Slowly he leaned down, capturing her lips in a tender kiss. She melted against him, arms looping around his neck. The warmth of her body, the taste of her lips, it all felt like a promise fulfilled. This time, there was no immediate danger. No fear of interruption. They kissed beneath the lantern-filled sky, letting the city's soft murmurs fade into the background. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "So what now?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She gazed at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "I need to ensure the city stabilizes, that peace negotiations resume. But I also want a life of my own, not just obligations." He nodded, threading his fingers through hers. "I get it. I've been drifting for too long, searching for a purpose. I think I found one here with you." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Then stay," she whispered, "at least until we figure out what the future looks like." He cupped her face, the flickering lantern light illuminating her lavender skin, the silver threads at her temples that pulsed with quiet vitality. "I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you want me to." She answered by kissing him again, deeper this time, her hands sliding into his hair. The moment was filled with unspoken vows, the sweet ache of possibility. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, letting the warmth of their bond seep into every corner of their hearts. In the following days, the city's transition of power began. Word spread that the rightful heiress had returned, bearing evidence of Keltith's misdeeds. The people, weary of corruption, rallied around her. Lirae oversaw the dissolution of Kelteth's mercenary contracts, ordering them to leave Vesharath or face justice. Many fled, others were imprisoned. The rightful alliance negotiations were resurrected with neighboring houses, though it would take time and diplomacy to fully repair the damage. Through it all, Rylan remained at Lirae's side, assisting however he could, whether it was negotiating with suspicious nobles or helping distribute relief to the poorer districts. When they finally found a quiet moment to themselves, it was in the palace's private gardens, a hidden oasis of strange alien flora that glowed softly under the planet's twin moons. Lirae led him to a secluded spot beneath a twisting tree whose leaves shimmered like insect wings. She turned to face him, her expression both solemn and tender. "I have decided that I will accept the role of caretaker for my people, at least until we are stable again. After that, perhaps I will travel, see the worlds beyond Vesharath. But for now, they need me." He took her hands in his, gently rubbing his thumbs over her knuckles. "I understand, and I'll help you if you'll have me." She lifted her gaze, eyes reflecting the moonlight in those violet and ember hues. "I would like that very much," she whispered. She stepped closer, her body pressing against his. "But there is something else I want." His heart fluttered. He lowered his voice. "Tell me." She reached up, her arms circling his shoulders. Her breath was warm against his ear. "I want you," she said softly. "Not just your jacket, but all of you." The confession sent a shiver down his spine. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her closer. Their lips met in a slow, burning kiss. They lingered in that garden, the soft rustle of leaves and the faint glow of the flora around them. The night was theirs, free from immediate threats. As their kisses deepened, he felt the urgency of their bond, the culmination of near-death experiences and emotional confessions driving them into each other's arms. She tugged him down a winding path through the foliage until they reached a small pavilion draped in silky fabrics. The air was thick with the scent of exotic flowers. They exchanged breathless murmurs, hands exploring, hearts pounding in unison. He removed his jacket, laying it on a cushioned bench. She slipped out of her outer robe, revealing the bandage on her shoulder. He gently traced the edge of it, concern in his eyes. "Are you sure you're healed enough?" he whispered. She responded by kissing him deeply, a soft moan escaping her lips. The heat between them built as they laid down together on the makeshift bed of cushions. He ran his fingers along her lavender skin, marveling at the subtle, opalescent undertones that caught the moonlight. She gasped when his hand brushed the sensitive curve of her ear, the elongated point twitching slightly. He apologized, but she guided his hand back, encouraging him to explore, to learn her body's responses. In return, she explored his, tracing the lines of his muscles, lingering on the scar on his cheek, whispering that it only made him more human and real to her. Their clothes fell away piece by piece, the night air cool against flushed skin. Every touch was deliberate, a reverent discovery of each other. When they joined, it was with a gasp of surprise and pleasure, her resonance hum mingling with his ragged breath. She pressed her forehead to his, eyes closed, as if focusing the synergy of their bodies. He felt a subtle vibration, a gentle wave that seemed to sync his heartbeat to hers. Their movements became fluid, guided by whispered words of affection. It was an intimacy both physical and deeply emotional, a culmination of trust and survival and longing. They clung to each other, the tension of the past days melting into this singular moment of connection. Afterward, they lay entwined, breathing slowing to a soft rhythm. She rested her head on his chest, fingertips tracing idle patterns along his arm. He brushed a kiss against her hair, the faint violet sheen catching the moonlight. They didn't speak for a while, content in the shared silence, hearts still beating in tandem. Eventually, she lifted her gaze to meet his. Her voice hushed. "I never thought I could feel this free." He stroked her cheek, his own eyes misting with emotion. "Me neither." He paused, searching for the words to capture the depth of what he felt. I've spent so long running from my guilt, my past. But here, with you, I finally feel like I found something worth fighting for, living for. She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. And I thought I was condemned to be a pawn, a title. You showed me I could choose my path. She leaned in, their lips brushing in a gentle kiss. Thank you. They spent the rest of the night in the garden pavilion, talking in hushed voices about the future. Hers as a reluctant ruler who hoped to guide her people into peace. His as a former pilot now forging a new life by her side. There was no talk of leaving the planet immediately, no talk of grand adventures beyond the stars. For the moment, they had each other, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, stability returned to Caith Tira. The alliance negotiations resumed with the other houses, and Lirae's leadership was tentatively accepted by the majority, thanks to the undeniable proof of Kelteth's treachery. Kelteth stood trial, his supporters dwindling. He spat venom at the proceedings, but the evidence was overwhelming. The once fractured city began to unite under the hope that the era of corruption was ending. Rylan worked alongside Lirae, helping to rebuild damaged infrastructure, distributing supplies, and using his mechanical expertise to repair vital equipment in the city. She relied on his counsel, not just for technical matters, but for moral support. At night, they would find each other in the palace's quieter rooms or in the garden pavilion, sharing stories of their pasts, dreaming of the future. Sometimes they would talk of traveling the galaxy once her duties were done, of seeing his home world or discovering uncharted planets. Other times they were content simply to hold each other, marveling at how fate had brought them together. Maven, for his part, returned to his caretaker role, though now it was more official. He served as Lirae's advisor, ensuring she didn't overwork herself or neglect the traditions that still held sway over many citizens. He accepted Rylan with cautious respect, acknowledging that the human had risked much to protect Lirae and the city. The old caretaker sometimes teased them gently, remarking how the heir to Veshareth had taken a sky-fallen pilot as a companion. One afternoon, as they strolled through the palace halls, Lirae paused by a stained-glass window that depicted an ancient Vekathra queen. The sunlight filtering through cast a rainbow of colors over her lavender skin. She turned to Rylan, a thoughtful expression on her face. I once hated the idea of wearing a crown, she admitted, but now I see it as a responsibility to protect my people. And if I can do that without losing myself, maybe it's not such a burden. He gently took her hand. You won't lose yourself, I won't let you. She gave him a tender smile. Then stand beside me as my partner. Help me guide Veshareth into peace. He bent his head in a playful bow. I'd be honored. Then he pulled her into a soft embrace, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She hummed a gentle note, a resonance that vibrated through him, a comforting echo of their bond. In the final days of the transitional period, the city held a grand ceremony to mark the official condemnation of Kelteth's regime and the restoration of rightful leadership. Lirae stood before the assembled crowd in the main square, wearing ceremonial robes that highlighted the silver patterns along her temples. Rylan stood at her side, not as a subject, but as an equal, holding her hand discreetly behind the folds of her robe. Maven announced the official charges against Kelteth, and the crowd cheered when Lirae declared a new era of openness and fair trade. That night, fireworks of shimmering mineral fragments lit the sky, and the city buzzed with cautious joy. Rylan and Lirae slipped away from the festivities, climbing a staircase that led to the highest balcony of the palace. From there, they could see the entire city spread out below, the lanterns and fireworks illuminating the streets in a riot of color. She leaned against the balustrade, her black-violet hair blowing in the breeze, eyes shining with relief and a quiet excitement. He joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. They stood in companionable silence, listening to the distant laughter and music. Eventually she spoke, her voice soft. We did it. Besharath is free from Kelteth's grasp. He smiled, resting his chin on her shoulder. You did it. I just shot some bad guys and fixed a beacon. She turned to face him, eyes full of affection. We did it together. You gave me the courage to come back, to fight. And now, she trailed off, a small laugh escaping her lips. Now I suppose we have to figure out how to actually run this place. But at least the war is over before it truly began, he nodded, tightening his hold on her. I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay as long as you need me. She reached up, brushing her fingers along his cheek. I want you here, by my side. And someday, when things are stable, we'll see the galaxy together. That's my promise to you. He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. I'll hold you to that. They shared a long, tender kiss under the starlight, the fireworks painting bursts of color across their entwined silhouettes. It was a moment of profound peace, of finality, and of new beginnings all at once. In that kiss lay the promise of a future forged in shared struggle, trust and love, a future neither of them could have imagined before fate threw them together on this desert moon. When they finally pulled apart, they looked into each other's eyes, and the unspoken truth was there. They had both changed irrevocably, shaped by the trials they had overcome. The old wounds of guilt and betrayal had not vanished, but they no longer defined them. Together, they had carved out a path forward. Besharath had a chance at peace, and they had a chance at happiness. Lirae rested her head on his shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. Stay with me tonight, he smiled, heart full, always. And so they remained on that balcony, watching the final bursts of fireworks fade into the night sky, secure in the knowledge that their journey, while far from simple, was at least theirs to shape. They had faced enemies, both external and internal, and emerged stronger, bound by a love that was no longer tentative or uncertain. In that quiet, starlit moment, they both knew this was not an ending in the sense of being incomplete. It was the resolution of the conflict that had threatened them, the conclusion of a perilous chapter. Their love, newly forged and battle-tested, would endure whatever came next. And for now, that was enough.